Well, hey everybody, welcome back to class and welcome to Module 3, Learning Disabilities. I hope that you're doing well and I hope that you've got your semester off to a great start. And I wanted to summarize some key ideas for you here just for the next minute or two before you look at the lecture notes and do your discussion question and do your homework on the learning disabilities. Let me ask you this question. Do you know someone? My hunch is you probably do. Do you know someone who has a learning disability? Or maybe you yourself have a learning disability. We have a lot of students who come through our program in human services and they themselves have learning disabilities. My hunch is you know someone who has a learning disability. Learning disabilities are very, very central to a class like this. You can't really talk about a class where we're talking about problems of children and adolescents and not talk about learning disabilities. It's a huge area of interest and concern, especially in the last 10 to 20 years when it comes to kids. And so that's kind of the focus of this module, learning disabilities. The learning disabilities are one of what we call the developmental disorders or disabilities. And we're kind of starting our class with a lot of those. Intellectual disorder, intellectual disability, which we talked about in module number 2, is an example of a developmental disorder. ADHD, which we're going to talk about here later, is an example. Autism spectrum disorder is an example of a developmental disability, as are learning disabilities. And what that word developmental means, I mentioned this last week in our video lecture, is it just means that these are struggles where the symptoms have to be present in childhood. It does not mean that they're always diagnosed or assessed initially in childhood, but there are certain types of struggles that we know that if it is a true struggle, the struggle or the problem or the symptoms, if you want to use that word, always show up in childhood. And this would be an example of the learning disabilities. A learning disability is a disorder or a disability or a deficit that almost always first rears its head and shows itself in early childhood, normally when kids go to school. Now, again, I mentioned in the notes this week, in a way, the learning disabilities are new. Now, they're not new. People have been struggling with dyslexia and dysgraphia and some of the other learning disabilities you're going to learn about in this module forever. They're not new as far as our experience. They have been around forever, really. But they're new in the sense that really, just in the last 50 years, probably, which for some of you may seem like a long time. That's not a long time. For the last 50 years, really, is when we have gotten a handle as a community and as a field, as a profession, as a society, around these things called learning disabilities. They did not exist by name until about 50 to 60 years ago. They existed in existence, but we did not have names for them. And through our research and brain scanning and understanding how people learn, all that kind of stuff, we have developed this idea of what is called a learning disability. And so you're familiar, my hunch is, with many of them, and they're somewhat fairly new in a way, but they're not. But they're kind of new to our understanding. And in the last several generations, last generation or two, we've just learned more and more and more, and we're learning more and more and more. I don't want to age myself, but some of you might be close to my generation. And back when I was in school, they did not diagnose or assess for learning disabilities when I was coming through school. I knew of no one my age who had dyslexia. Now, kids had dyslexia, but no one was identified as having or diagnosed with it. Kids were just called slow. Unfortunately, they were called dumb by their peers, especially. They were called remedial learners. They had to be in special education or resource or whatever. I did not ever come to understand what a learning disability was until I got as an adult into graduate school in counseling, that I really began to understand what learning disabilities really were. And so that's really different now in a good way. Today, we know what learning disabilities are. We know how to identify and to assess for them. And especially in elementary school, teachers and school districts should be, hopefully, they're on kind of the lookout for them, I hope. And as parents, oftentimes we're on kind of the lookout for them. We recognize that they are real and that they exist. Now, I want to compare real quickly learning disabilities with what we talked about last week, intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities, which used to be called mental retardation, and learning disabilities, this module, are different. Now, they're similar in that they're both developmental disorders, but they're very, very different. Okay. Now, sadly, many people back in previous generations who had learning disabilities were often labeled as being mentally retarded, unfortunately, which is inaccurate. And unfortunately, many people of previous generations who had learning disabilities, kids and adults, maybe they were called retarded, or maybe they were called with an they were identified as having an intellectual disability. Intellectual disabilities, as we talked about last week, are disorders and deficit where we have a deficit in intellectual and cognitive functioning, intelligence, we would say. Learning disabilities are what they say they are. They are disabilities where there is a deficit in learning. Now, I put in your lecture notes this week. It's interesting, and you know this. Intelligence and learning are different from each other, but they're related to each other. They are connected to each other. The way you and I gain intelligence is through learning, if that makes sense. The way you and I gain intelligence is the level of information and knowledge that I possess at any given moment and how I use that then in everyday living. That's intelligence. How do we gain intelligence? Through learning. We learn through experiences. We learn through studying and going to school. We learn by reading. So learning is a part of intelligence, but it's different from intelligence. So learning disabilities, learning is the uptake, it is the upload of new information and the storing and the organizing and the processing and the analyzing and the recalling of that information. Learning is a multifaceted kind of a complex brain process. We use the term learning all the time. We all kind of act like we know what it is, and we do know what it is. But when we talk about learning, learning involves attention and motivation. It involves our senses, like our eyesight and our ears. It involves motivation. It involves intellect a little bit, right? And so learning and intelligence are interwoven with each other, but they're different. Intellectual disabilities, where people have deficits in intellectual and cognitive capacity. Learning is where people have deficits in the uptake of new information, the way in which the brain processes and uploads new information. That's learning. So when people have learning disabilities, that's where the problem is. The problem is in the acquisition of and the uptake, the uploading, if I can use a computer term, the uploading of new information. That process is in some ways limited, or that process in some ways, there are deficits there. And people struggle with the uptake of new information. Now, that doesn't mean they cannot learn. You and I are always learning, okay? So just because someone has a learning disability doesn't mean they cannot learn. It just means that oftentimes there are deficits, or they may be slow, or their brain may work differently in processing learning and learning new information. So people do learn, obviously, but the way in which they learn, it may take more attention, it may take more time, it may require more effort, so to speak, right? So here's the thing, and again, many of you may know this from experience, and I mentioned this in our notes this week. Most people who have learning disabilities are very intelligent, very bright. That may seem interesting, but it's true. In my experience as a professor, in my experience in my own personal life, in my experience as a professional counselor, the vast majority of people who have learning disabilities like dyslexia are super smart. And that's interesting when you think about this idea of, wow, that people can have a learning deficit or deficits in how we learn, but yet people can be so bright and intelligent. That's because intelligence and learning are two separate things. And so most people, if you're a parent in the room, if you've got a child, a son or a daughter with learning disability, you know that they're super smart. I've had the last time I taught this class in the classroom, probably about a year or two ago, I asked for students to share me their testimonies. And there were two moms in the room who talked about, one talked about her daughter and one talked about her son. They both had this thing called dyslexia. And they both shared how, of all of their kids, their child who had dyslexia really was the brightest. And as weird as that is, they say, really, it's probably going to go the farthest. It's probably, my son who has dyslexia is the one who's most interested in science and technology, and is the one who I go to help me fix when I can't get my login to work. I go to them. And here's a child who has a learning disability, but yet is bright and is smart. It's an interesting dynamic that we oftentimes see. I believe that happens because the brain compensates. And so what compensation is where there is a deficit, the brain then overcompensates for strengths in other areas. Maybe you've known someone who was hard of hearing or was blind, and there's a deficit there. Well, people, for example, who are really blind, who are blind, for example, have vision impairment, they are their memory is super, super strong. They have almost like a photographic memory. Well, that's because the brain has to compensate because they can't see things The brain has to remember everything that it hears. That's called compensation. And so we see it all the time. And we see it with learning disabilities, especially. People have deficits like in reading, but yet they're super gifted and talented and super smart. They can figure problems out just on their own without even having to look at something. So we see that a lot in kids and in adults. And by the way, too, learning disabilities, even though I didn't say this earlier, although learning disabilities are developmental disorders, they do affect people of all ages. So I'm probably talking to some adults right now. You're an adult. You're not a teenager or a kid. You're an adult, and you have a learning disability because you are an adult who has a learning disability, right? And so just because someone is diagnosed in childhood, these are not childhood only disorders. Adults have learning disabilities as well too. Really quickly, let me also mention this too. Number one, learning disabilities are brain-based neurological problems that run in families genetically. Learning disabilities are not caused by poor parenting. They're not caused by poor schools. They're not caused by too much technology or FaceTime or video games. Kids are born with learning disabilities, is the way I believe. We believe that learning disorders and learning disabilities are neurologically brain-based and that they run in families, just like almost everything else that is chemically neurologically based tends to run in families. Um, kids who have a learning disability are much more likely to have at least one blood relative who also too has the similar or same learning disability as they do, because we believe that they're neurologically brain based, and so therefore they run in families. Again, people with learning disabilities are very, very smart and intelligent, but one of the things that's very, very sad is that when learning disabilities are not caught and identified correctly, there can be lots of negative consequences in people's lives, especially self-esteem and motivation. Your textbook talks a little bit about that as well too. Kids with learning disabilities and adults with learning disabilities can and do accomplish anything they need to accomplish. But is it possible that kids with learning disabilities have other issues like self-worth and self-esteem issues? Absolutely. I mean, imagine if you were told you were dumb, because kids oftentimes with learning disabilities are told, well, you're just slow. Well, you're not as smart as everybody else. Imagine being told that as like a 9-year-old, right? For years, kids of all ages with learning disabilities have been told stuff like that. So oftentimes people with learning disabilities, especially if they're not caught early and kids understand what is kind of going on within them and how to overcome them, and that they are smart, there can be some social and emotional negative consequences potentially with learning disabilities. Hopefully that we're seeing less and less of that with each passing generation, but that is possible. And so if unrecognized, there can be problems. And then lastly, here's this. I want you to pay attention as you go through the module this week and look at the 4 categories. Now, there's more than 4, but generally speaking, an easy way to understand learning disabilities in both children and adults is to realize that they kind of have 4 different families or categories, and there's often overlap between those 4. The most commonly diagnosed learning disabilities in the area of reading comprehension. So you're familiar with dyslexia. Now, dyslexia is not the only reading comprehension type of learning disabilities, but it's the most commonly understood, it's the most commonly diagnosed. So sometimes with learning disabilities, people have problems with reading comprehension. And I give you some examples in the notes this week of how that could look. And dyslexia is the most common reading disorder. Also, too, math disorders. Now, before anyone gets too excited, just because you are not good at math does not mean you have a learning disability. I was never really strong in math. That's part of why I was probably drawn to social services, right? But I don't have a math learning disability. So just because you don't like math or you've had to take college algebra twice does not necessarily mean you have a learning disability. But some kids and adults have a learning disability in the area of math that can be assessed and evaluated. The most commonly diagnosed math learning disability is something called dyscalculia. You'll read a little bit about that in your notes this week. It's sometimes called math dyslexia. Dyslexia and dyscalculia are very similar in that there are some similar processes that we see. But that is, if you've never heard that term before, look in your lecture notes and read a little bit about dyscalculia, another commonly diagnosed learning disability. And then writing and spelling. So that would be the third one. Sometimes with learning disabilities, kids and adults have problems with writing and spelling. And dysgravia. Dysgravia is the most commonly diagnosed writing and spelling disorder. Last fall, a year ago this semester, In one other, I didn't even know what class I was teaching. I mentioned learning disabilities in one of those classes, and I mentioned in passing dysgraphia because I have a relative who has dysgraphia, and so I know a little bit about it. And so I mentioned it in passing. And as the class dismissed that day, as students were leaving, a lady in the class caught me. She says, I'm glad you mentioned dysgraphia. She said, my son has that. And she said, I didn't even know what it was. And sometimes I'll talk to my family members and talk about it, and they'll say, well, what is that even a real thing? And she said, he really struggles with it. She's like 9 or 10. And she said, he is super, super smart. He can barely write. And she said, he feels at school so out of place. And so the teacher has him typing everything. And she said, at first, I didn't know what was wrong with him. But she said, he is a gifted athlete. He's super, super smart, but he can barely write. And she said, I just thought something was wrong with him. And he was evaluated by his public school district. And he was diagnosed as having dysgraphia. Again, if you're not familiar with what that is, go and look in the lecture notes and look at dysgraphia. And then the last, fourth category of learning disabilities is kind of the newest one, and it's what we call cognitive and auditory processing disorders. And the most commonly diagnosed there is APD, auditory processing disorder. If you've never heard of APD, it is an emerging, I'll say it's a new disorder. Go read about it in your lecture notes, and you can even go online and do a little Google research on auditory processing disorder. In my opinion, it probably is one of the most underdiagnosed learning disabilities. It could be one of the most underdiagnosed disabilities, period. In my experience, especially as a professor, you don't know how many times I've had students come to me and say, can you repeat for me what you were saying in class earlier? And I say, sure. And I'll repeat it, and they'll say, you know what, sometimes I don't understand stuff well. And I'll ask them usually, do you have a problem with hearing? And almost always they say, no, it's just as I'm listening to stuff, stuff gets jumbled in my head sometimes. And I'll say, oh, okay. That doesn't mean necessarily that is what's called auditory processing disorder. That can be something we can see with ADHD and other kinds of struggles. But auditory processing disorder is a fairly new emerging an example of a learning disability. It belongs to the family of the cognitive processing disorders. And I give you some information about APD and dysgraphia and dyscalculia and dyslexia in our notes this week. Okay, Module 3, learning disabilities. Look at your textbook, do your homework, do your discussion question, look at all the notes, and hopefully get a little bit more information about the learning disabilities and how they affect kids and teenagers. And I will see you next time. Have a good week.